Hi Yogi, and welcome to the first ever episode of the Breathing Club. In this series I'm hoping to illuminate some of the mysteries and techniques around yogic breathwork. So of course, with this being the introduction, I'm going to start just by giving you a little bit of general context around this topic. Then we'll dive a little bit deeper into the history and discuss some of the more recent scientific research that has been happening within this field. We'll also discover some of the benefits of practicing these techniques on a regular basis. And finally, I'll close that out by taking you through a way of counting your pranayama exercises that we'll be using throughout this series. And as always, I will leave you some timestamps in the video description below, so you can hop around this topic however your heart desires. And from here, we'll dive right in. So, pranayama, as it is known in Sanskrit, represents the fourth of the 8 limbs of yoga. So it's very much its own field of study within the yogic discipline. And typically, when we translate the word, we tend to separate it into its 2 component parts. So firstly, of course, we have prana, which is typically translated as life force. But when we go all the way back to the first ever time that the word was used, and we kind of look at the context of how it was used, it actually seems to have originally meant inhalation, the breath that comes into the body. And so it's really interesting to think that the idea of life force, our ability to stay alive, has always been really strongly connected to our ability to breathe. And the second word, of course, is typically thought to be yama, and yama means to control or restrain something. So the restraint or control of our breathing, our life force. Sometimes people do argue that actually, because in Sanskrit the A in the middle of the word can become almost like a way of joining the 2 words together, that actually what we're trying to translate is prana ayama rather than yama. So in that case, if we put an A in front of the word yama, it starts to mean the opposite thing. So rather than saying we're trying to control or restrain the breath, we're actually trying to liberate and free the breath. And you know, with all these things that are very historical, and especially in the case of translations, it's really up to us to also add our own interpretation. So don't feel too restricted by the sort of literal way of translating things. In order to understand the value of practicing these techniques, we sort of have to give a little bit more context to the breath itself. So really, breathing is one of only 2 autonomic functions in the body that we have control over. Autonomic really means that those things happen whether we're thinking about them or not. The body sort of takes control over things such as our digestion or the release of certain hormones in order to keep us alive at all times, because that's really the body's primary goal. And the breath alongside blinking those are really the only 2 things that we can choose to control if we consciously think about it. So if I'm consciously thinking about it, I could now blink faster or slower. And the same goes for the breath. So you do have the ability to change how you breathe. And equally, for most of us, if we get angry or excited or nervous, the breath will automatically change in order to cope with that situation. So if we're taking control of our breath, it's actually the fastest way to change our physical and mental state. And that is the true benefit of these techniques. The interesting thing about studying breath in this particular moment, after we have all lived through this very collective global experience that was very much linked to our breathing, is the fact that for a long time nobody was that concerned with how we breathe. Certainly in the medical and scientific community, people felt that, you know, however you breathe is how you breathe, and that's really it. But, you know, the truth is that there are good and better ways of breathing, and there are some ways of breathing that actually might have a really negative effect on your overall health and well-being. So we will sort of discuss that a little bit, but I will also link a book in the video description below that's really going to dive a lot deeper into the scientific aspect of our breath than I really have the time to here. But I think the studies that everybody is always most riveted and fascinated by are the sort of two more recent studies that involved Wim Hof, who is known as the Iceman, and he is a well-renowned breathwork teacher who holds multiple Guinness World Records in which he's swum long distance underneath ice sheets, or he's run maybe half or full marathons across ice barefoot, and he has facilitated all of that through his breathing techniques, which are very closely related to yogic breathing techniques. So in 2011, scientists in a controlled environment injected E. coli bacteria, which are the ones that tend to give us food poisoning, into Wim Hof's system. And through his breathing techniques, he was able to regulate his immune response and suppress the response. And so he ended up not having any symptoms after being injected with these bacteria. And that was super fascinating, of course, to the scientists, but really it was just one guy who had studied this for a long time, and maybe he was just a genetic freak. So then in 2014, they went back in and they took on 24 volunteers. And they split that group in half, so 12 of these volunteers would study for 10 days with Wim Hof. He would teach them his techniques, and the other 12 would be a control group and they would do nothing. And after 10 days, all 24 of these people were injected with E. coli bacteria again. And of course, as you probably guessed it, the 12 people who had studied the techniques and practiced them were immune, essentially. They were able to override the bacteria with their immune system and then regulate the response so that they were completely symptomless. And of course I have to specify that 24 participants isn't really a big enough sample size of the population to really have this study be peer reviewed. I think we would need around 100, if not 1,000 people in order to give us that sort of definitive proof that these techniques really work. But I still like to talk about this study because really it is fascinating that after only 10 days, these people were able to apply these techniques and change the outcome of their immune response. And, you know, it sort of says that Wim Hof isn't a genetic freak. Those of us who work with yogic breathing techniques, we're not somehow genetic anomalies, but actually this stuff is available and achievable to anyone who practices on a regular basis. And some of this stuff is recorded in older, maybe even ancient documents that talk about how these techniques were used by yogis hundreds of years ago in order to achieve similar sort of feats of strength, let's say, that really yogis used to refer to as siddhis, which is kind of the yogic idea of superpowers. And you know, some of these yogis are said to have sat in meditation doing their breathing practice and melting several meters of snow around them. Or there's other stories of one particular yogi who bet a Maharaja that he could die and stay dead for a month and then resurrect himself. And really the way that he did that is by slowing his breath down, which in turn slowed his heart rate down so much that people believed him to be dead. And then he was buried in a tomb, but of course at night he would get up, go eat and drink, and then go back into the tomb during the daytime. And he did that for an entire month and then collected a cash prize at the end. So fairly comical stories of how these techniques have been used in the past. And even if we have no intention of achieving these sort of superhuman levels of breathing abilities, if we practice these techniques on a regular or semi-regular basis, there's still ample amounts of benefits to us in our everyday life and well-being. Top of my list would be the fact that these techniques really are able to decrease symptoms of anxiety, stress, and depression. They can help us cope better with symptoms of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Equally, they can help us to lower and stabilize high blood pressure. Of course, as we've discussed, they can help us navigate our immune response and improve our immunity. Equally, they can help improve our energy levels quite immediately. And finally, sort of the most important one in terms of applying it to our actual yoga practice would be the fact that really breathing techniques help us to center ourselves and bring our attention inwards. Oftentimes, for most of us, we live in this very externalized kind of world that's constantly grabbing for our attention from all different places. And the breath is sort of a way to very much instantly connect with what's going on with ourselves internally, which is why we use these techniques right at the beginning of practice mostly. That ability is also something that we would use if someone was, for instance, was having a panic attack. The breath is usually a way to instantly kind of draw your attention back into the present moment. And that's sort of the main chatty part of this video. I'm now going to demonstrate a way of using your hand in order to count as you're going through your breathing exercises, which we will come back to fairly regularly as we move through this series. And of course, if you forget how to do it, you can always come back here and just rewatch this particular portion. So for the purposes of demonstrating this to you, I'm going to just point the flat palm of my hand towards the camera. But typically, because I'm using this before I meditate, I would be sitting down and I would rest the back of my hand on my thigh or knee. So if you're testing it for yourself while you're watching me, then that's a more comfortable way of doing it. And really, this technique is helpful because when you're doing your breath work, what usually happens is that focusing on the breath work itself, on that technique, is already going to take up a lot of brain space. And then if you have to also count each breath or each round of repetition, then that's almost like too much information to hold in your mind. So this is a way of using your hands to help you keep count. And what we usually tend to do is everywhere where we have a line across the fingers here, the space between becomes a segment that we can count. So this, for instance, would be the lower part of the index finger, this will be the middle part, and this is the tip. And then we use the thumb as a counter. So the thumb starts at the base of the index, that's 1, middle of the index is 2, tip of the index is 3, tip of the middle finger is 4, tip of the ring finger is 5, tip of the pinky is 6, down the pinky, middle is 7, base of the pinky is 8, and then you hop across, base of the ring finger is 9, base of the middle finger is 10, middle of the middle finger is 11, and middle of the ring finger is 12. And then if you have to count further, you go backwards. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 9, 10, 11, 12. And you'll notice that this is sort of a snail-like movement. You're going around the outer rim and then all the way inwards. If I just reverse and fast forward that a few times for you, you should be able to see that sort of this circular movement where you're feeling around the fingers. And that's really all there is to it. Okay, so that's it really. If you have any particular techniques that you would like me to cover early on, then drop me a comment down below, let me know, and I'll be happy to film those for you. If you like the video, of course, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Maybe you're kind enough to share this with your friends and spread the good word to grow this wonderful community of yogis here on YouTube. I would be ever so grateful. And of course, if you want to find me anywhere else online in the meantime, I will leave my social media links in the video description below, and I hope to hear from you soon and see you back on your yoga mat for practice very shortly. Thank you so much for joining me today, and see you soon, yogi. Bye.